Hello and welcome to Lamplighter. Today is July 8. Today is one of the saddest black marks in the history of the people of God, because today in our daily Bible reading, we read about the fall of Israel. The prophets have been forecasting it, but no one has really been listening. And despite the numerous prophetic warnings, Israel continues to reject her God. And because of this, we're going to see that the end for them is very near. This is really, in essence, an extremely brief account of one of the darkest hours in the history of God's people. So we begin the narrative in our reading in Israel. Hoshea is the king of Israel. Shalmaneser is the king of Assyria. At the beginning of our reading today, we are reminded that where we left off, Hoshea, the king of Israel, is a vassal, you might say, to Assyria. He is paying the king of Assyria tax money. He is paying tribute as sort of a bribe to make sure that he can, in essence, keep Assyria at bay, to keep his people safe. But because of his own personal fear of Assyria and his lack of confidence in Assyria doing exactly what Shalmaneser has promised, Hoshea starts to look for help elsewhere. And so Hoshea then goes southward and tries to make an alliance with the king of Egypt. He wants to protect himself still further. The problem is that Shalmaneser, who is the king of Assyria, discovers this attempted alliance. It infuriates him, and he comes with his hordes of armies against Samaria, against Israel, to conquer them. And as he does so, he imprisons Hoshea the king, and then he puts Samaria under a 3-year siege. After this 3-year period, Samaria ultimately falls. And in the next several sections of our reading today, we have this very brief account, but a powerful story, a powerful narrative about the people of Israel finally succumbing to their own sinfulness and their rebellion against God and being carried into captivity by a neighboring nation, the nation of Assyria. So Israel is taken captive, and I want to draw your attention in today's reading to this section entitled, The Reason for Israel's Fall. This is very, very important that we take note of this because there are some lessons for us here as well. The reason for Israel's fall. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshiped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger. They worshiped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." You see, they're doing everything opposite of what God has commanded, and God is now holding them accountable for it. They have ignored the prophets' warnings. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all the prophets and seers, "Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey, and that I delivered to you through the servants, the prophets." But they would not listen, and were as stiff-necked as their fathers, who did not trust in the Lord their God. That's the beginning of their downfall. They do not trust God and take him at his word. So they rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their fathers and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. Listen to that again. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do. And they did the things the Lord had forbidden them to do. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts and they worshiped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sorcery and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Israel has really gone off the deep end. They are horribly rebellious against God. But even though it's Israel that's being taken captive now, Judah is not a whole lot better. We read in this section entitled, Judah Not Perfect. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore, the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they had made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam, by the way, is the one who enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted, however, in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not move away or turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned them through all the servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. Now that's a lengthy passage, but it is so important to see how terribly rebellious the people of God have been, how God has begged with them, pleaded with them for penitence, pleading with them to turn and follow him, giving them prophets, his servants, with a message of hope, and they still ignore the prophets. They still do exactly as they want to do. So foreigners invade or inhabit Samaria. Assyria comes through. They leave some of their own people in Samaria to inhabit the land, along with a few of the Israelites who are left behind. These 2 people, the Assyrians and the Israelites in Samaria, intermingle with one another, and therefore the Samaritan tribe or breed, you might say, is created. This is why in much later years, the Samaritans are so hated by those who consider themselves to be true Jews, because they represent an intermarriage with pagan people. So these foreigners have inhabited Samaria. They don't really know God, and so they're living there just like they would live anywhere, and they are not worshiping the Lord. It angers God, and so this is interesting. He sends lions among them, and the lions are attacking the settlers there, and they're not sure what to do. So in the section on page 861, entitled Samaritans Mix Religion, we read this: Then the king of Assyria gave this order: have one of the priests you took captive from Samaria go back to live there and teach the people what the God of the land requires. So one of the priests who had been exiled from Samaria came to live in Bethel and taught them how to worship the Lord. Nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns where they settled and set them up in the shrines the people of Samaria had made at the high places. They worshiped the Lord, yes, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate for them as priests in the shrines at the high places. They worshiped the Lord, but they also served their own gods in accordance with the customs of the nations from which they had been brought. When the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites, he commanded them, do not worship any other gods or bow down to them, serve them, or sacrifice to them. But the Lord who brought you up out of Egypt with mighty power and outstretched arm is the only one you must worship. Do not forget the covenant I've made with you, God says, and do not worship other gods. Rather, worship the Lord your God. It is he who will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. But they wouldn't listen, would they? They would not listen, but persisted in their former practices, Even while these people were worshiping the Lord, they were serving their idols. And to this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their fathers did, like parents, like children, as they follow in the ways of sin. As the scene shifts back right at the end of our reading today to Judah, we see that Hezekiah is still working on reforms there, and he rebels against Assyria. Hezekiah rebels against the king of Assyria. He refuses to serve him, and then even goes on to defeat the Philistines. Things are still going pretty well for Hezekiah in the south. But what a sad day this has been as we see sin and rebellion yielding separation from God. The same is still true today. When we live in sin, we are separate from God. Let today's reading be an eye-opening experience, a reminder for us. Isn't it great to be a lamplighter? His word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. I hope you have a blessed day.